A difficulty with act utilitarianism is the question of how does one measure pleasure? Someone can make simple preference judgments among alternatives for one's own consequences, but what about acts that affect many people? How does one know what others would consider to be good consequences? If I'm the decision maker, I might think this is a good consequence for you, but you may disagree. What about long-term and short-term consequences? If we only focus on the short-term consequences, we may pick something that's going to cause a lot of long-term pain for short-term pleasure. Although we intuitively reject using people, nothing in act utilitarianism prohibits using some persons in ways that would bring happiness to others, as long as the balance of good consequences is in favor of the majority's happiness. For example, a few workers in a Chinese sweatshop have a miserable life, but consumers around the world can enjoy powerful but cheap smartphones. A final difficulty with act utilitarianism is the chaos and burden of calculus of the ratio of good to bad consequences for each specific action or each specific decision. Let's look at an example that points out a problem with act utilitarianism. What if we could develop robot slaves that would work for us as human beings? Now, this is really no problem if they're just machines, but what if they were more like humans? What if they were capable of intelligent thought? What if they were capable of emotion? This is a question that needs to be resolved because we're working in this way with artificial intelligence. Whose happiness or utility counts? Is it just human beings? What about animals? What about other sentient creatures? What about other intelligent creatures like dolphins? What about sentient androids? Or is it really just only humans whose utility, whose pleasure, whose well-being counts for decision-making? Also, what if the misery of only a few of whoever counts could benefit many? So one is harmed and 1,000 benefit. Would consequentialist ethics see that as the right thing to do? Well, what if the ratio changed? What if it was one who was harmed for two who benefited? Act utilitarianism would not prohibit this per se, because still more are benefiting than are being harmed. And so the greater happiness of the majority outweighs the harm to the minority, and actions are judged on the production of the greatest net happiness. So act utilitarianism is not appropriate for judging the ethics of these types of situations. Also, act utilitarianism makes leisure difficult to justify. To better understand this aspect of act utilitarianism, compare the consequences of watching YouTube videos all day or going out and watching sports all day on your day off to the consequences of doing charity work all day. One could produce the greatest net happiness, overall happiness for society, by doing charity work on one's day off rather than by watching YouTube or sports all day. According to act utilitarianism, then, the right thing to do on one's day off is to go out and do charity work. It would be wrong to relax all day. As we will see, the other type of utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, tries to fix some of the problems that arose with Bentham's original act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism distinguishes between the individual's ethical relation to the rule and society in the single act. For example, should I keep the terms of a specific contract that I signed? And the ethical status of the rule itself. In rule utilitarianism, the rule itself is evaluated on the consequential good for society of certain kinds of actions by similar classes of agents. For example, the rule may be all people should keep their contracts, because that achieves better consequences than the alternative of people not abiding by the terms of their contracts. If people abide by the terms of the contracts they sign, that leads to a greater stability of society. The rule then functions as a standard by which to evaluate a single act, and it works deductively. For example, people should keep their contracts for the stability of society. I have made a contract, therefore I should abide by the terms of this contract that I signed. Notice how this differs from act utilitarianism. In act utilitarianism, an act is judged as good or at least not bad if more benefit than are hurt by it. But in rule utilitarianism, an act is good if performance of a similar act by all similar agents would produce the best results for society overall, a sort of what if everybody did it approach to ethics. It can also be what if everybody has done so in the past. Thus, a single act is right because it follows a rule. But the rule is right because the consequences in society, if everyone keeps that rule, are better than the consequences of any alternative rule. So it's not just because we have this rule, it's because the consequences of that rule being followed are better than any other alternative. So rule utilitarianism is in some ways a way to develop ethical principles, but it doesn't start with a list of principles, unlike, say, principle-based ethics. Instead, it starts with the consequences if everyone does some actions and then uses those to develop principles based on what's going to lead to the best outcomes for everybody overall. Stated another way, in rule utilitarianism, the utilitarian standard should not be applied to individual actions, but to society's moral code. Instead, individual actions are evaluated by whether or not they follow that rule. Society's moral code holds that society should adopt a set of rules that's going to allow it to maximize overall well-being in the long run. And the rules that make up that code then provide the basis for distinguishing right actions from wrong actions. Like precedents in legal cases, rule utilitarians view each case as a potential precedent that should apply as a rule in the future for all similar cases. So you can see the relationship between rule utilitarianism and the law. The relationship between utilitarianism and business focuses on two different approaches: a profit maximization approach and a public policy approach. According to the profit maximization perspective, based on the traditions of Adam Smith, free and competitive markets are the best means for attaining utilitarian goals. So the profit maximization perspective promotes policies that deregulate private industry, protect property rights, allow for free exchanges, and encourage competition. In such situations, decisions of rationally self-interested individuals would result as if led by an invisible hand in maximizing individual happiness. The public policy perspective, on the other hand, turns to policy experts who can predict outcomes of various policies and then carry out the policies that will attain utilitarian ends of maximizing overall happiness. Let's look at a success story of the public policy approach. Many countries, including the US, have a voluntary system of organ donation where you indicate whether you are willing to donate an organ should something happen to you. The United Network for Organ Sharing is a nonprofit scientific and educational organization that administers the only organ procurement and transplantation network in the US. It was established by Congress in 1984. It manages the national transplant waiting list, matching donors to recipients. It also develops policies to best use the limited supply of organs and give all patients a fair chance at receiving a needed organ, regardless of age, sex, ethnicity, religion, lifestyle, or financial or social status. It does, however, consider the health of the individual and the likelihood of a healthy transplant. So what are the utilitarian ethics of creating a rule that people can voluntarily agree to share their organs after death, and that those organs will be distributed based on the greatest need and best chance for post-transplant health improvement? I think this approach implements rule utilitarianism pretty well and achieves goals based on that sort of public policy approach to utilitarianism. On the other hand, China harvests organs from executed prisoners. These organs are then sold to the highest bidder. Now, what are the utilitarian ethics of a rule that a government takes organs from those it executes? Now, it does create a supply of organs from people who were going to be killed anyway, but does the rule that seems prevalent in many parts of the world, that the highest bidder gets an available organ, lead to the best overall happiness? Well, probably not. Someone who could have waited or has a less severe issue but has more money gets the available organ. But someone without as much money but a greater need for the organ could die. Now, this is going to create less overall well-being than a system like the US, where the organs are allocated based on need and health, and both the wealthy and the poor are more likely to live. So how does utilitarianism differ from other forms of consequentialism? Well, all forms of consequentialism consider results or consequences in evaluating alternative courses of action. But utilitarianism is unique in that it is welfarist. In other words, acts promote welfare or well-being. We ought to choose our actions with a view to how they're going to affect, say, overall human welfare or overall human happiness. Utilitarianism is also universalistic. It takes everyone's interest into account equally. It is aggregative. It sums everyone's well-being to determine the overall value of an action's consequences, and it's maximizing. It requires one to produce as much well-being as possible. Now let's look at another form of consequentialist ethics, hedonism. In hedonism, the value of consequences depend only on the pleasures and pains they create. We're not concerned with other forms of utility, such as profit maximization or welfare or happiness. We're just focused on pleasure and pain. Opponents to hedonism object that not only pleasures are intrinsically valuable, other things are valuable independently of whether they can lead to pleasure or help us avoid pain. For example, one's love for one's spouse does not become less valuable when one gets less pleasure from one's spouse because he or she becomes sick or disabled. Similarly, freedom seems valuable even when it creates anxiety, and even when it is freedom to do something, such as leave one's country, that one does not want to do. Also, many people value knowledge of things, such as learning more about other galaxies, despite the lack of clear consequences of creating pleasure or helping avoid pain by gaining this knowledge.